So, as I was thinking about this Hispanic Heritage Service, I thought about Revelation 7:9. If you have your Bibles, let's turn there. It's not part of our normal teaching series, but I thought it was appropriate. So in Revelation 17:9, the Apostle John is sitting there having this vision, and part of it he says, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and people and languages, standing before the throne of the Lamb." Standing before the throne of the Lamb, clothed in their white robes and palm branches in their hand, and crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." And as I thought about this, it says a people from every tribe, every tongue, every group. And it really just kind of drove home to me how universal Christianity is. And I think a lot of times, especially for me, I get stuck in this cookie-cutter view of it. So when I hear things like this, and even at my son's kindergarten graduation, they had a child come up and give a prayer, and he did it in Spanish, and it just opened my eyes. I said, this is global. This isn't just Journey Christian Church. This isn't just Jefferson, Louisiana. This isn't just Louisiana. It's not just the United States. Like, Christianity is for everyone. It is a global movement that God has started, and that he wants to save everyone. It's not just for us. And it manifests itself in different ways. In Haiti, it looks one way. In El Salvador, it looks another way. When you get to the European countries, in France, in Italy, when you go over to the Asian countries, Christianity is still being practiced, and it looks different. But just because it looks different to us doesn't mean it looks any different to God, because when we're singing praise as one voice, as one body of Christ, it is still being received as an offering. So I wanted to share that with you, because we are all coming together to worship Jesus and give praise and honor to God. And it doesn't matter what language we do it in. It doesn't matter, what songs we sing, as long as we're giving honor and glory where it is due. So as we get started today, we're going to be looking at the book of Esther. And that's where Miss Annie read from. And we're going to give it to you in English in a little bit, because I think it is such a pivotal verse in her story. So, but as we start, let me ask you, where are you in life right now? And I don't mean just geographically, like, yeah, we're all here in this building. But where do you work? Like, where are you in your journey of employment? Are you just getting started? Are you established in a career? Have you retired already? Who are the people that are in your circle of influence? Where are you that you can influence other people, that you can have sway in the lives of others? What skills or abilities do you have in life that God has given you that come naturally, or what are some things that maybe you've cultivated? Leadership is one I think of initially. Like, some people, you hear the term, they're a born leader. Some people have to cultivate it. Some people have to read books, go to seminars, study it. And they could still be as effective as those that are born with it. What has happened in your life, whether good or bad, that's brought you to where you are today? Now, I want you to think about this as we go through today's message, because I think it's really important. I look back on my life, and the things that have happened to bring me here today to Journey, I don't think you'd believe if I told you. There's so many quote-unquote coincidences that happened at that time that when I look back, I'm like, man, that was all God. That has nothing to do with me. I didn't make this choice. Or if I did make this choice, and God still used it to bring me to where I am. And so even though the answer to all these questions are going to be different for each one of us, they have a purpose for our lives today. They help shape us and get us where we are. So as we continue in a series, again, we're going to talk about Esther today. I have 4 characters that we're going to introduce, and you'll see them throughout the scriptures. The first one is Xerxes. Now, Xerxes is a Persian king, and he's got a wife, Queen Vashti, and we'll hear about her in a minute. The second person is Haman. he is the king's right-hand man. That is the king's advisor, his most trusted and loyal servant. The third is Mordecai. Now, Mordecai is a Jew, and we'll see that Mordecai ends up adopting his niece. And then the fourth one is Esther, the title of our story, and she is Mordecai's niece who gets adopted. And what we're going to see is that each one of these characters has their own role in the orchestra that God is organizing that ultimately leads to the salvation for all of us, or leads to the possibility of salvation for all of us. So at the beginning, you see there's a massive banquet, and King Xerxes is there, and when they did banquets in the old days, like way back in the BCs, they lasted weeks and weeks and weeks. They're very big, very opulent, very extravagant. And at one of these days, the king goes, "Hey, tell my queen to come see. I want to show her off to everybody." And now some of y'all may be thinking, "Oh, that's so sweet. He loves his wife. He wants to parade her around and show her off." Nope, not like that at all. Xerxes did it as a show of intimidation, a show of force. He says, "I am the king. I have the most beautiful wife, and she's going to do what I say." Well, Vashti, not complying, says, "Nope, I'm not doing it." And this really angered Xerxes. So ultimately what he does is he says, "Look, if she doesn't want to listen, I'm getting rid of her. She's no longer my queen. We need to find someone else." So y'all seen the story Cinderella, right? So this is what happens now. Xerxes sends out his officials into all of the provinces of his kingdom, and he's trying to find a new queen. Just like in Cinderella, how the king is searching for a bride for his prince, they go to find every fair maiden, everyone in the land who they think will please the king. But the difference was, in Cinderella, they were asked to go. In Persia, they didn't have a choice. If they said, "Hey, you're pretty, you're coming with me," you couldn't say no, or if you did, you went anyway. It didn't really make a difference. So let's look at Esther in chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 5. So in chapter 2, starting in verse 5, it says, "Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter." So now we see two of our main characters introduced. We see Esther, and what's the one thing it tells us about her above all? She is very attractive, right? So, I mean, we could all picture that in our minds in different ways. But remember that during this Cinderella search, they found her. They saw she was very attractive, and so they took her. She didn't have a choice. And when they took her, they brought her into a harem with hundreds of other women from around the kingdom. And these women, if you see in verse 12, they spent a full year being prepared just to go in front of the king. And when I say go in front of the king, that doesn't mean, "Oh, hey, look, you're going to be queen." No, that's go in front of the king to see if you're good enough for him, to see if he finds you attractive enough, to see if he thinks you fit that profile. I mean, she was just being used for his desires. But if we look at verses 16 and 17 in chapter 2, we see that this year paid off. It says, "And when Esther was taken to King Xerxes into his royal palace in the 10th month, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." Now, something really neat here is there's such a quick response by Xerxes. There was no interview. Be like, "Hey, what's your favorite book? What do you like to do on the weekends?" I mean, that's important, right? That's what you do. I haven't dated in a long time, but you got to be like, "Hey, what's your favorite color? What kind of music do you like? What movies do you watch? What do you do on the weekends?" You got to have similar interests, right? Well, their similar interest was her beauty. She didn't really care about it, but Xerxes loved it. And he's like, "Boom, that's it. I don't need to see anybody else. She is my queen." That didn't work for me when my wife, I had to chase after her. And I even told her, I was like, you are beautiful. She's like, pfft. I was like, yeah, if only I was king of Persia. But one of the things, if we were to read all of chapter 2, we see all these things. And we see that even though it's not specifically mentioned, the hand of God is guiding each one of these instances. He's guiding every occurrence, every interaction, every happenstance to get her here. Nothing that Esther nor Mordecai did could have affected this outcome. I mean, again, she was forced to go. And even though it was the rulers of Persia that were forcing her, God was behind it providentially. And so we see that God brought Esther to the royalty of Persia and made her a queen. But you know, all good stories, all good fairy tales have to have an evil villain, right? Because if it did, then it would end, right? It would end right there. But this is where we see Haman, the king's advisor. He gets insulted by Esther's uncle Mordecai one day. He's riding through the city, through the streets, and in Persia, they bowed to their nobles, to their royalty, to their advisors. And it wasn't something formal. It wasn't like, hey, I'm showing you respect because you are my supervisor, you are my superior. They looked at it as a form of veneration. They were being worshipped by the people that they passed. So Mordecai, being a God-fearing Jew, when Haman goes past, he stands up. He's not bowing down because he knows what they take it to mean. And he doesn't want to be seen as somebody worshiping one of the Persian officials. So Haman gets really, 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 really mad at this. He is offended. He takes this personal. And he devises a plan to wipe out not just Mordecai, all of the Jews, every last one of them throughout the kingdom. So in Esther 3, verse 8, I got to read this. It's the way he says this, it's really, really, really amazing. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There's a certain people scattered about and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not in the king's profit to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed." Now, I read this a few times, and one of the times I read this, I was like, it sounds like he's describing a cancer, an unwanted part of your body that could infect everything because it's not listening to your immune system. It's not following the commands of your body. And so Haman says, let's eradicate it. And with cancer, that's a great thing. With the people of God, it's horrible. But Haman, he knows just what to say. He gave the king just enough information to tilt his ear to say, hey, look, these guys aren't beneficial to you. I'm not telling you who they are. I'm not telling you really why they're not beneficial other than they don't listen to you, but we need to get rid of them. And so Xerxes says, yeah, go for it. And he sent out the decree into all of his kingdom that said, hey, on this date, this people group is to be destroyed. Now, of course, Mordecai, living in the kingdom, he hears of this, and he is just devastated. These are his people. And so he goes into a time of mourning. In those days, when they went into a time of mourning, they would put on sackcloth, and they'd rub ashes on their face, and they wouldn't eat. And they would just wail and cry out to God. So when Esther hears of this, she sends him clothes and sends him food and says, hey, look, man, you got to get yourself together. What's going on? And Mordecai, they played a telephone game. I thought it was really cool. It was like the ancient version of telephone because he couldn't go to her, she couldn't go to him, so they had somebody going in between them. It's like, man, that's pretty neat. So Esther sends her representative, and Mordecai says, hey, look, give her this. This is a copy of the order that your husband, the king, just sent out. And so with that order, he asks her, he says, beg for mercy. Go to your husband. Go to the king. Say, hey, what is going on? These are my people. But there's two problems with this. The first is that anytime in Persian law, if a king issues an order, it is ironclad. It cannot be taken back. You cannot rescind that order. Be like, oh, hey, sorry, I made a mistake. Because again, the Persians looked at their rulers as gods. And if a god makes a mistake, well, then he's obviously not a god. And then the second is that no one can just approach the king. In chapter 4, verse 11, Esther is responding to Mordecai through their telephone game, and it says, all the kings and servants of the people of the king's province know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there's but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. She goes on and says, but as for me, I've not even been called to come into the king for the last 30 days. This is the king's wife. She is the queen of Persia, arguably the second in command. And even she is not exempt from this law. She can't even go to her husband to say, hey, babe, how was your day? Without being summoned. He has to say, hey, babe, I want you to come and ask me about my day. Come talk to me. That sounds miserable. I'm sure my wife would like that. Leave me alone. And additionally, it's been over a month. It's been a month where she hasn't even been called to see her husband. So this seems like the deck is stacked against her, right? She can't go, and she hasn't been called. So what's the odds of this prevailing? And in verse 12, it goes on, it says, and they told Mordecai what Esther said, that she hadn't been called for the last 30 days. And Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do you think that you yourself that is in the king's palace, you will escape any more than all the other Jews? Mordecai told her, said, look, I understand what you're saying, but this is the situation. And today we would say Esther was stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, if she doesn't go to her husband, she's going to be found out to be a Jew, and she'll be dispatched with all the rest. And on the other hand, if she goes in front of her husband, there's a very real possibility that she can be put to death as well. I don't know what decision I'd make. But you see, and this is the verse that Miss Annie read earlier this morning. And Mordecai really drives the point home when he says this. In verse 14 it says, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But as for you and your father's house, you will perish. And this part right here, I think this is key. It says, and who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? God has guided Esther to be queen. In this choosing, it wasn't for her personal benefit. And Mordecai says that right here. He says, and who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So now I want to ask you again, where are you in life? And as you think about this, start thinking about the answer, and then ask yourself, how can where I am be used to benefit the body of Christ, to benefit God's church? Now I want to give you a word of caution. You may not like the answer you receive. God called Esther to a rock and a hard place, death in one hand, death on the other. I don't know if I'm ready for those choices. I don't know if I want to be called that. But if God does answer you with a rock and a hard place, if we respond faithfully and we step out, He also provides us the strength to prevail. You see, for Esther, she relied on her fellow Jews. Towards the end of the telephone game, Esther sends her attendant back to Mordecai and says, let's fast. She says, you gather all the Jews in Susa and fast for 3 days. No eating, no drinking. And she said, me and my female attendants, we will do the same. And now it doesn't say it, but the thing with the fast is most of the time, 99% of the time, fasting is accompanied by prayer. So Esther and her attendants, all the Jews in Susa, were fasting and praying to God, asking for deliverance, asking for a way to get through this. And I'm convinced that during this time of prayer and fasting, God granted Esther with wisdom and discernment. Because on the third day of the fast, she ends up putting her plan into action. And that plan is that she got dressed up. She knows what the king likes. They've been married at least 30 days, we see, because he didn't want her for 30 days. And she was chosen initially from everybody out of the kingdom. So she's like, all right, boom. I'm going to do my hair like this. I got my makeup like this. I'm going to wear his favorite dress. I'm going to wear his favorite dress. No, not me. Okay. So she gets dressed up and she goes. Now imagine that. Imagine having to go into a room where the guy on the other side is like, hey, I might kill you. And you just kind of walk in there nonchalant, be like, hey, I hope he sees me, peeking behind a wall, be like, I don't know if I want him to see me yet. He might not be in a good mood. Is he in a good mood? Like, I'd be a nervous wreck with that. So, but she gets dressed up and she goes into the inner courts and goes into the presence of the king. But again, this isn't Esther. This isn't Xerxes. This is the providence of God. And by his guidance, the king is pleased with her. Puts the golden scepter out to her and grants her entrance. And now, it's amazing how he goes from not wanting anything to do with her for 30 days to seeing her, and the first thing he says to her, in chapter 5 and verse 3, it says, and the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom. Now, I mean, I don't know about many of y'all, but if somebody just wins the lottery and they go, hey, what's your request? Up to half of my winnings? I'm like, half, please. I'll take half. I'll take half. I don't need anything else. Half's good. But he says, up to half of my kingdom. She's guaranteed to receive it. This isn't, oh, maybe. No, if he says it, it's got to happen. But instead of her seeing what would benefit her, owning half of the Persian Empire, she uses that God-given wisdom and discernment. And she invites the king and Haman, his attendant, who sent out the letter against the Jews, to a banquet. Now, at that banquet that night, they're eating, they're drinking, and they're having a great time. And again, Xerxes says, my queen, what is your request? Up to half my kingdom. And again, she uses that God-given discernment, and she says, I'm just going to ask you and Haman to come to a banquet again tomorrow. So then Haman goes home, and he is elated. He said, I am the second in command. The queen invited me personally to a banquet, and again tomorrow. He's bragging to his wife, his kids, anybody who will listen, his entire household. He is on cloud 9. And so the next day comes, and the second banquet. But this is where she reveals her plan. She reveals, again, he says, what is your request? Up to half my kingdom. And she reveals instead the scheme of Haman and identifies herself as a Jew and says, hey, your order wants to eradicate my people. And the king's like, who did this? Who is the one behind this? Because he said, I didn't order the killing of the Jews. And she goes, it was him, and points to Haman. Now the king's furious. You want to kill my wife and her people? So he storms out the room, and Haman is begging Esther for mercy. He is at her feet, fawning all over, saying, please, no. But that's the wrong thing to do, because the king comes back in, and now sees Haman hanging on his wife. That's not going to end well. So without going into too much detail, Haman is dispatched of. He is gone. There is no more Haman. So one problem is taken care of. The mastermind has been eradicated. But there's still another problem. The order still remains, and it cannot be rescinded. It cannot be taken back. So in Esther 8, in verses 5 and 6, Esther is pleading with the king. She says, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if these things seem right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes. Notice she repeats that, because that's how she got to be queen. She was pleasing in his sight. She was pleasing to his eyes. So she repeats it. She says, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if things seem right, and I am pleasing in his eyes. Let an order be written to revoke the letters derived by Haman the Agagite. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? And all this groveling, all this begging, all of this, she's so beside herself with grief. It can't change the fact that this order is still in place. But she does find favor with the king. And the king knows the law. He says, I can't rescind it, but you go. You take my ring, you send out another decree from me. And again, she's very, very, I don't want to say cunning, but she uses that God-given wisdom and discernment. Because she writes a letter in the king's name, and it goes out to all the provinces. And what it does is, it says, yeah, look, you can still follow this first order. You can still attack the Jewish people. But this order says they can fight back. And I mean, if you're going against an unarmed foe, that's an easy victory. But if you have a group of people that are now ordered to fight back for their lives, you might second guess taking that fight on. And as this order went out, it gave strength and courage to the Jewish people.